And now, back to this evening, for the first film in tonight's double bill of horror. BBC Two joins the people of a small New Mexico town in the hunt for the Leopard Man.
Welcome back to the Horror Double Bill, the show where we pair two films that, when viewed together, create something far greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week I'm diving into a world of paranoia, shadows and suspense, with two films that, at first glance, might not seem like natural bedfellows. But trust me, they share more than a few unsettling ingredients. First up, it's The Leopard Man from 1943, a moody horror noir from producer Val Lewton and director Jacques Tourneur, the same team behind Cat People and I Walked with a Zombie. Then we'll leap forward to 1971 for Dario Argento's Four Flies on Grey Velvet, a defining entry in the stylized violence that is Italian Giallo cinema. Two very different films and two very different filmmaking styles, and yet both share a key murder set piece and protagonists haunted by guilt, whether it's grounded in reality or bubbling up from somewhere deeper and far darker. I mentioned the term Giallo just then, and as this genre of film is something we are going to be discussing many times over the series, as I'm a huge fan, it's probably worth defining exactly what a Giallo film is. The word Giallo, which is Italian for yellow, comes from the bright yellow covers of crime novels that were published in Italy by the publishing house Mondadori, beginning in 1929. These paperback mysteries introduced Italian readers to the likes of Agatha Christie, Edgar Wallace, Raymond Chandler, and, importantly for this week, Cornell Woolrich. Over time, Giallo became shorthand for murder mystery, very similar to the way in which the term noir is now used to describe hard-boiled detective stories. In cinematic terms, Giallo films are mystery thrillers, but are most often viewed through a distinctly Italian lens. They can be heightened, surreal, and often wildly stylized. The genre's roots lie in American studio thrillers of the 1940s and 1950s, and a bit more on that later, as well as the German krimi films of the early 1960s. But the first official Giallo film is widely considered to be Mario Bava's The Girl Who Knew Too Much, which was released in 1963. This film introduced several tropes that would become staples of the genre. First of all, it gave us highly stylized and dramatic cinematography. But importantly, it also featured a protagonist travelling to a foreign country, knowing few or no people, who becomes witness to a murder, and who then has to gradually uncover the clues to unmask the killer, just in time to avoid becoming the next victim. Bava followed this with his film Six Women for the Killer, or Blood and Black Lace, in 1964, which added vivid colour palettes, fashion-forward costume design, and a sense of baroque, almost operatic violence, hallmarks that would go on to define the Giallo aesthetic. Other early entries include Lucio Fulci's One on Top of the Other, and Antonio Margetti's Naked You Die, which I'm going to give a special mention to here. It plays pretty much exactly like a Giallo episode of Scooby-Doo and has a theme song that has been shamelessly ripped from the Adam West Batman series. It's not the best Giallo in the world by any stretch of the imagination, but I absolutely love it and it has a very special place in my heart. In addition to these, there were also a number of films from director Umberto Lenzi, which includes Hollywood star Carol Baker starring in Orgasmo, which is also known rather helpfully as Paranoia, and Hollywood star Carol Baker starring in Paranoia, which is also known as A Quiet Place to Kill. This, by the way, is also not to be confused with Lenzi's 1971 Giallo called An Ideal Place to Kill. Confused? You're not the only one. But it was Dario Argento's The Bird with the Crystal Plumage that truly launched the genre onto the international stage, triggering a wave of similarly styled films. Over time, the Giallo split it into subcategories: psychological Giallo, rural Giallo, and briefly and gloriously in the 1980s, disco Giallo. Despite all the twists, turns, and stylistic detours that the genre has taken over the decades, most gialli, to give them their plural name, tend to share a familiar set of ingredients. These were tropes that were first introduced by Mario Bava and then later refined, reimagined, and cranked up to fever pitch by directors like Dario Argento. For a start, there are the titles. Long, strange, sometimes animal-themed, and becoming increasingly surreal as the genre evolved. We get gems like The Black Belly of the Tarantula, The Iguana with the Tongue of Fire, Don't Torture a Duckling, The Bloodstained Butterfly, The Case of the Scorpion's Tail, and Lizard in a Woman's Skin. Moving away from the animals, there are also titles that sound more like accusations. What have you done to Solange? Who saw her die? What have they done to your daughters? And perhaps my favourite one, what are those strange drops of blood doing on Jennifer's body? Which is also known as the Case of the Bloody Iris. But it's not just the lengthy titles that define the Giallo. Many of the films are known for their elaborate, almost operatic murder set pieces, which are stylized to the point of surrealism. The killer is usually masked and clad in black leather gloves, their identity hidden until the final act. The protagonist, who conducts a parallel investigation alongside the official one, is sometimes an artist, such as a writer or musician, sometimes a journalist, sometimes they are an amateur sleuth, and sometimes they're just some poor soul who wanted a quiet holiday in the sun. Visually, many gialli are an absolute feast for the eyes, featuring bold colour palettes, surreal lighting, disorientating camera work, and dreamlike editing that often pushes the narrative into something closer to a waking nightmare. But by the 1980s, the golden age of the Giallo was all but over, with only a few directors, including Argento, carrying the torch forward. But before the end of this period, it had become highly influential, particularly on the North American slasher film, influencing movies such as Black Christmas and even Friday the 13th. However, the Giallo never truly disappeared, and recent years have seen a resurgence in interest, thanks to boutique labels like Arrow Video, Shameless Entertainment and Severin Films, who have lovingly restored and re-released many of these long overlooked gems. The genre's influence is still also very much alive in more recent films, including Edgar Wright's Last Night in Soho and James Wan's *Malignant*. And Giallo will be a recurring theme throughout this series, as I mentioned. But if you're looking to take a deeper plunge in the meantime, I highly recommend the documentary All the Colours of Giallo and the YouTube channel Katie of the Night, where friend of the podcast Katie is meticulously documenting her journey through the genre, as well as many other cult, horror and exploitation movies. So before I get into this week's films themselves, I just want to give a quick nod to the sources that have helped shape this episode. For The Leopard Man, I've drawn from the books Dreams of Darkness by J.P. Telotte, Val Lewton, The Reality of Terror by Joel E. Siegel, and Icons of Grief, Val Lewton's Home Front Pictures by Alexander Nemerov. And for the section on Four Flies on Grey Velvet, I've consulted Fear, the autobiography of Dario Argento, Four Flies on Grey Velvet by Luigi Cozzi, Broken Mirrors, Broken Minds by Maitland McDonough, and Dario Argento, The Man, the Myths and the Magic by Alan Jones. So let's get on to the first film in this week's double bill, which is The Leopard Man from 1943. It was directed by Jacques Tourneur and produced by Val Lewton. It was written by Ardell Ray and Edward Dean and was based on the novel Black Alibi by Cornell Woolrich. It stars Dennis O'Keefe, Margot, Jean Brooks, James Bell, and Isabel Jewell. When we talk about horror auteurs, we usually mean directors. People like David Cronenberg, Dario Argento, and George A. Romero. And perhaps more recently, Robert Eggers, Ari Aster, or Jordan Peele. These are filmmakers whose unmistakable fingerprints are all over their work. But we rarely think of the producer as an auteur, and if anybody earns that title, it's Val Lewton. Lewton produced 9 atmospheric horror films for RKO during the 1940s, films that didn't just shape the genre's golden age, but also quietly influenced the likes of Martin Scorsese, William Friedkin, and Guillermo del Toro. He was born in 1904 as Vladimir Ivanovich Hofschneider, or possibly Levinton, depending on which biography you're reading, into a Jewish family in what then became part of the Russian Empire. His father was a moneylender and his mother was a pharmacist. But the family's true cinematic inheritance came via his aunt, a woman called Alla Nazimova. She was a legendary silent film actress and an occasional scandal magnate, who was busy rubbing shoulders with the likes of Rudolph Valentino and redefining early Hollywood glamour. After his parents separated, Lewton's mother took the children first to Berlin and then to the United States, where they moved in with Aunt Nazimova, who was by then an established Broadway and Hollywood star. Lewton's mother reinvented herself as Anna Lewton and became a screenwriter, a remarkable achievement for a woman at the time, and one that no doubt helped set her son on his creative path. Even as a teenager, Lewton displayed a flair for fiction, perhaps a little bit too much. While working as a society reporter, he was fired for fabricating an entire story, which was about a truckload of kosher chickens perishing in a New York heatwave. Dubious journalism, and possibly quite a slow news week, but a fantastic narrative instinct. He studied journalism at Columbia University and became a prolific writer, publishing fiction, poetry, non-fiction, and pulp novels. In 1932, he had a bestseller with his book No Bed of Her Own, which was adapted into the film No Man of Her Own, starring Clark Gable and Carole Lombard. But Lewton also had a more provocative side. Under the guise of a lost Russian manuscript, he secretly published an erotic novel which was entitled Grushenka, 3 Times a Woman. In the censorship-heavy climate of the time, this was a bold, perhaps borderline reckless move. Had the truth come out, he would certainly have found himself landing in serious legal trouble. Lewton's success as a novelist eventually led him to Hollywood, though not in the glamorous and champagne-soaked way that one might imagine. He started at MGM Studios, not as a screenwriter, but writing novelizations of films for magazines and promotional tie-ins. Hardly the stuff of legend, but it paid the bills, and it got his foot through the door. His real break came when he joined the ranks of David O. Selznick's production company. Selznick, at the time, was one of Hollywood's most powerful producers, and Lewton began working for him, first of all, as a humble story editor, but he quickly proved to be invaluable. He was the one who was tracking down and securing the rights to literary heavyweights, such as Julius Caesar and A Tale of Two Cities, quietly building a library of projects that would become the envy of Hollywood. By 1942, Lewton had developed a reputation as a sharp and reliable storyman, and that's when RKO Pictures came calling. RKO were desperate to compete with Universal's lucrative monster movies, and they had decided to launch a new horror unit. They wanted somebody who could deliver low-budget films that were cheap to make and easy to market, and for them, Lewton fit the bill. He later claimed he got the job due to a misunderstanding, and that someone at RKO had heard he wrote horrible novels and assumed that that meant horror novels. Regardless of the reason, he accepted the offer and was given his own production unit, along with a very specific set of limitations. Only horror movies. Budgets had to be capped at $150,000 per film, which is about $2.5 million today. Running times had to be under 75 minutes, and the titles were dictated by the studio, usually based on whatever tested well in market research, and artistic merit be damned. On paper, it sounds like a creative death sentence, but Lewton treated it like a challenge and turned restrictions into strengths. His films became exercises in suggestion, elegant psychological horror stories where the real terror lurked in shadow, in silence, and more often than not, the mind of the viewer. He also surrounded himself with a small but fiercely talented creative team, including Jacques Tourneur, Mark Robson, and Robert Wise, who would later go on to direct West Side Story, The Haunting, The Andromeda Strain, and, most horrifying of them all, The Sound of Music. Lewton took a great personal interest in every film that came through his unit, and often rewrote and refined every script, whether he received credit for it or not. Although he was rarely on set during filming, his presence was felt in every frame. Director Mark Robson once said, quote, "He had already thought everything out in such detail that very little of what he was concerned with had been left to chance." End quote. And this perfectionism paid off. His first film in this new role was Cat People in 1942, directed by Jacques Tourneur. The studio had been anticipating something along the lines of Universal's The Wolfman, a straightforward monster movie with fangs and fog. What they got instead was a shadowy and psychologically rich story about fear, repression, and the quiet terror of suggestion. It was a massive success. Cat People marked the beginning of a trilogy with Tourneur, which was followed by I Walked with a Zombie, and finally The Leopard Man, which is the film we're focusing on today. Lewton had a deceptively simple formula for horror, one that he famously summarized as, quote, 3 scenes of suggested horror and 1 of actual violence. Fade out. It's all over in less than 70 minutes. End quote. That formula, tight, restrained, and psychologically precise, became his trademark. For Lewton, horror didn't shout, it whispered, and that whisper proved to be hugely influential, not just on his contemporaries, but on filmmakers for decades to come. Before I get into the film itself, I want to take a moment to talk about some of the cast, because their stories, in some cases, are just as fascinating, and sadly just as tragic, as anything that we see on screen. First up, we have Jean Brooks, who plays Kiki Walker, the nightclub singer caught up in the film's central mystery. If her name doesn't immediately ring a bell, that's because Hollywood never really knew exactly what to do with her. She had a striking presence, haunting, slightly otherworldly, and with a face that was perfect for noir and horror. But her career was sadly all too brief. She started as a nightclub singer and guitarist, before landing supporting roles, eventually signing with RKO Studios in the early 1940s. She appeared in a handful of films there, including a few of the Falcon Detective series, and she made an incredibly strong impression in another Val Lewton movie, The Seventh Victim, in 1943, which we'll be discussing later in this series. And then tragically, it all fell apart. Alcoholism, a few too many public incidents, and suddenly RKO had no interest in her. By 1948, she was finished in Hollywood, and she sadly passed away in 1963 at the age of just 47, as a result of complications from alcohol. She was buried at sea the following year, on September the 10th, 1964. Her burial was reported in the papers in Costa Rica, where she passed away, but there were no obituaries, and apparently no knowledge of her death in Hollywood. So little, in fact, that 27 years after her death, on August the 7th, 1990, the following appeared in the Hollywood Reporter. Quote, "Does anyone know the whereabouts of Jean Brooks? Once married to director Richard Brooks, thus her name, she was also known as Jean Kelly and was under contract to both Universal and RKO in the 1940s. Even Richard Brooks and several of the actress's former pals say they've lost all contact with her." End quote. Then there's Dennis O'Keefe, who plays Jerry Manning. O'Keefe actually had a solid career, even if he's not exactly a household name. He started in vaudeville, because that seems to have been the natural way of things back then, and then worked his way into Hollywood. Clark Gable spotted him and thought he had potential, and got him signed to MGM Studios. That sounds ideal, except MGM was essentially an actor factory, and if you didn't become their next big star, they had no use for you. As a result, O'Keefe left MGM around 1940 and started to carve out a niche in crime dramas and the occasional comedy. He also has some real noir credibility, starring in the films T-Men in 1947 and Raw Deal in 1948, both of which were directed by Anthony Mann. And he wasn't just an actor, he also dabbled in screenwriting under a couple of pseudonyms. He kept working in film and TV into the 1960s, but unfortunately, like so many of his generation, O'Keefe was a heavy smoker, and lung cancer caught up with him in 1968. And then there's Margot, who plays Clo-Clo, Kiki's nightclub rival. She's probably got the most fascinating backstory of all three. Her full name was Maria Margarita Guadalupe Teresa Estela Bellardo Castilla y O'Donnell, and she trained as a dancer with Rita Hayworth's dad. She also performed with her uncle Xavier Cugat's band, and was eventually discovered by screenwriter, director, novelist, and general polymath Ben Hecht. She worked in both Hollywood and Broadway, appearing in the films Lost Horizon in 1937 and Viva Zapata in 1952. But then Hollywood decided that she was a problem. She was blacklisted in the McCarthy era, firstly for supporting the Hollywood 10, a group of actors who had refused to testify to McCarthy's House Un-American Activities Committee, citing the First Amendment of freedom of speech and freedom of association. As a result, all three were sentenced to prison for refusing to cooperate, and were also blacklisted by the studios. Margot also attended an anti-Franco rally, who we spoke about last week. She supported refugees and was also an advocate for peace. And all of this, of course, was enough for her to be marked as a political threat in the notorious anti-communist blacklist, Red Channels. Her husband, Eddie Albert, managed to survive the blacklist because he was a decorated World War II veteran, and it was hard for Hollywood to ignore a war hero. Margot, unfortunately, was not so lucky. However, instead of fading into obscurity, she pivoted to activism. In 1970, along with trade union activist Frank Lopez, she co-founded Plaza de la Raza, which is an arts and education center in East Los Angeles, and it's still running today, providing year-round programming in arts education. So while Hollywood shut its doors on her, she left something far more meaningful and significant behind. And at this point, if you haven't seen it, now is the time to hit pause because we're about to dive into spoilers. As of the time of recording, you can find several versions of the film on YouTube, and with a running time of just 66 minutes, you can safely watch it and then come back. The Leopard Man was the third and final film that Val Lewton made with director Jacques Tourneur, and it was based on the novel Black Alibi by Cornell Woolrich, who, incidentally, had been a fellow student of Lewton's at Columbia University. Woolrich himself is a fascinating figure. He was, by sheer volume alone, one of the most prolific pulp writers of all time, particularly when it came to suspense and crime fiction. During the 1940s, he produced a string of hard-boiled and paranoia-driven novels, including the novels The Bride Wore Black, Phantom Lady, Deadline at Dawn, and Black Angel, all of which would later be adapted into films. Originally, the book Black Alibi had even been considered as the basis for Cat People, before Lewton decided to take that film into a completely different direction. However, if you look at the poster for Cat People, it actually features the same leopard graphic that appeared on the cover of Woolrich's novel, which is a nice little visual link between the two projects. Although Lewton relocated the story from South America to New Mexico, structurally the film keeps the episodic structure of its original source material and follows a series of characters who are all linked by a series of murders. At the time, this approach wasn't particularly well received. Some critics dismissed the film as a half-baked attempt at shock and mayhem, while even Jacques Tourneur himself later admitted that he wasn't fond of the film, saying, quote, "It's just a series of vignettes and too episodic," end quote. But looking at it now, this approach actually feels far ahead of its time. The way that the story is told, with multiple characters going about their individual lives, linked only by an overarching plot device, feels very similar to the structures we would see in films from directors like Richard Linklater, Robert Altman, Quentin Tarantino, and Paul Thomas Anderson. In that sense, The Leopard Man is not only one of the first Hollywood serial killer films, and more on that later, but it's also a film that anticipated modern, non-linear storytelling decades before it became a trend. The central link between our three characters is, strictly speaking, not really a leopard at all, it's more of a Black Panther, which is presented as a publicity stunt by nightclub singer Kiki Walker. She has received it from her agent Jerry Manning, and the plan is to one-up her competition, a dancer named Clo-Clo. Of course, the leopard escapes, and soon after, people start dying. What makes these deaths stand out, though, is the way that they're filmed. Tourneur and Lewton use lighting, sound, and suggestion to build dread, rather than just relying on shocks or gore. In fact, the film's murder sequences feel very modern, particularly in the way that they stage their horror as self-contained set pieces, something that would later become a staple of the Giallo genre. This should perhaps come as no surprise to anyone who's seen Cat People and who remembers the infamous swimming pool scene or the Central Park sequence. In this film too, we get moments of pure tension, which are created through light, shadow, and sound. The standout example is the sequence where young Teresa Delgado is sent out to buy corn early in the film. It's a masterclass in suspense and uses the simplest of elements: wind blowing through the bushes in the arroyo, shadows under a rail bridge, a train suddenly passing overhead, to create something that is truly terrifying. The way that her death is staged is unforgettable. We see her mother slow to unlock the door, thinking that she's teaching her daughter a lesson. Then comes a desperate pounding at the door, a scream, and finally a pool of blood seeping under the threshold. It's as shocking as anything made decades later, and in the end, the mother's own guilt is as horrifying as the death itself. This idea of guilt, accountability, and the consequences of small, selfish decisions runs throughout the film. The police chief even calls Jerry Manning out on it, criticizing, quote, people who want publicity and don't mind how they get it, the risks they make other people run, what agony and sorrow they bring to other people, end quote. Kiki and Manning attempt to assuage their guilt by quietly slipping money to the Delgado family, an act of penance, really. It's this guilt that also propels them into investigating the murders that follow, but they're not the only ones that are haunted by their conscience. Teresa's mother, as I just mentioned, shuts her out of the house to teach her a lesson, an act that leads directly and horrifically to her daughter's death. There's also the small character of Raul, the lover of a later victim, Consuelo, who drowns himself in drink after her murder. And then we come to Charlie, the carnival worker who originally owned the leopard. Guilt eats away at him to such a degree that he eventually begins to wonder if he might somehow be responsible for the killings. Eventually he turns himself into the police, saying that if he does things like that, he wants to be put away, and that he doesn't want to hurt anybody. Another recurring theme in the film is the idea that people are at the mercy of fate, and this theme is quite literally summed up in the film's symbolic image, a small ball dancing on top of a fountain in a nightclub. At one point, Galbraith, a museum worker, sums this theme up with a line that feels almost existential. He says, quote, "I've learned one thing about life. We're a bit like that ball dancing on a fountain. We know as little about the forces that move us and move the world around us as that ball does." End quote. And then there is Clo-Clo, who pays several visits to see a fortune teller. She mocks the woman, of course, but not enough to stop going back. There is a belief under the bravado, as there so often is. The fortune teller, played with weary mysticism by Isabel Jewell, is remarkably framed at one point as a kind of Virgin Mary figure, until the illusion is punctured by her taking a casual drag on a cigarette. And yet she does indeed predict Clo-Clo's final night, a chance encounter with a rich man, a sudden windfall, and something black moving towards her in the darkness. The message is clear. Fate has a plan for all of us, and ignorance doesn't mean escape. The film also leans heavily into the themes of class and financial struggle, particularly emphasizing the divide between the well-heeled Americans and the less fortunate locals. It's a tension that hums quietly beneath the surface, only to rise, quite literally, in the film's final moments. At the climax, we are presented with a dreamlike procession of black-robed figures, marking the massacre of the indigenous people by the conquistadores. This is a haunting reminder of the violence of outsiders against the original inhabitants of the land, and the entire film has been moving towards this point. One of the opening lines of the film is a cigarette girl grumbling that tourists only come to town to soak up Latin glamour, and that it's a bad town to be blonde, introducing a theme of exploitation that plays throughout the film. Outsiders come and take what they want, and then leave the wreckage behind. Kiki and Manning are the physical embodiment of this, as well as being the embodiment of sleek, moneyed comfort. It is their superficiality and need for attention that caused the first death, and then they try to paper over their guilt with cash, which puts them in sharp contrast to Clo-Clo and the other locals who populate the film. And as for Clo-Clo, in any other film she could quite easily have become little more than a two-dimensional good time girl victim, a stock character to be discarded once the plot demanded it. But thanks to the script and Margot's wonderfully textured performance, she becomes something far more layered and far more human. Clo-Clo is a woman trying to earn enough to support her family. She's spirited and sharp, but there's also a real warmth to her, a sense that beneath the wisecracks and fast talk, there's somebody trying to survive with a bit of dignity. For Clo-Clo, money isn't about glamour or indulgence or fame, it's about survival. So when she finally meets a wealthy man later in the film, she's refreshingly honest about her situation and tells him, quote, "Feelings don't buy houses, pay for rent, or help bring up kids." End quote. Interestingly, this same man has already offered a rather pointed warning about the pursuit of wealth, telling her, quote, "When you marry champagne, you can't trade it in for beer. You're stuck with it." End quote. One almost thrown away moment in the film comes when Clo-Clo tries to steal a single rose from a street vendor, not out of greed, but simply because she wants something beautiful. She's observed by a maid from a nearby house, who offers her a flower from a vast bouquet, noting that her wealthy employer won't miss just one. It's a small moment, but it's a very telling one, a contrast in class, in kindness, and also in what people notice, or don't. And in many ways, Clo-Clo is far easier for a modern audience to connect with than our nominal heroine Kiki, who begins the film as rather cold and self-absorbed, and, if we're being honest, doesn't really improve much as things go on. But what's truly startling about the Leopard Man is the revelation of the killer's motives. The killer turns out to be Galbraith, the mild-mannered man from the museum, the one who waxes lyrically about fate and destiny. And this is where the film does something genuinely radical for its time. It gives him no real motive. Galbraith doesn't kill out of jealousy or revenge. There's no trauma, there's no grand design. He kills just because he feels compelled to. Something inside him pushes him to do it. It's an irresistible urge. Now, whilst this idea had of course been explored in Europe in the Fritz Lang movie M, for a movie made in Hollywood in 1942, it's still quite astonishing. This strips away the comfortable moral framework that audiences were used to and replaces it with something far more disturbing. The idea that evil can be senseless. The idea that evil can be motiveless. And that sometimes people do monstrous things, not for any particular reason, but because they can't stop themselves. And the impact of this approach is hard to overstate. This was an era when cinematic killers were expected to have clear and recognizable motives: revenge, greed, jealousy, even love. But the Leopard Man presents something far more unsettling, and actually far more modern. The killer has no grand plan, there's no tragic backstory, there's no motive beyond compulsion. Galbraith doesn't really understand it himself. It's just something that he has to do. Now, this idea wouldn't fully take root in the cultural consciousness until the 1970s, when the term serial killer was first coined. So for a film made 3 decades earlier, it's practically revolutionary. And you don't have to take my word for it. Dario Argento himself was incredibly inspired by the Leopard Man, so much so that he pays direct homage to it in the film that we're discussing next. So our second film in this week's double bill is Four Flies on Grey Velvet from 1971. This was directed and written by Dario Argento from a story by Dario Argento, Luigi Cozzi and Mario Foglietti. It stars Michael Brandon, Mimsy Farmer, Jean-Pierre Marielle, Francine Rosset and Bud Spencer. Dario Argento is perhaps one of the most influential figures in horror cinema, and he was practically born into the industry. He was born in Rome in 1940 and was the son of film producer Salvatore Argento and Brazilian photographer Elder Luxardo. He began his career as a film critic, and this led to screenwriting gigs, including, most notably, a co-writing credit on Sergio Leone's Once Upon a Time in the West, alongside Bernardo Bertolucci. As I mentioned at the beginning of the show, his directorial debut, The Bird with the Crystal Plumage in 1970, wasn't only a hit, it was a cultural event in Italy. It was a major success and played a pivotal role in defining the Giallo genre, though Argento himself was less than thrilled with the wave of imitators that followed. In his autobiography, Fear, he admits that at the time he was infuriated by how many films copied his style. In hindsight, though, he now recognizes it for what it was, the birth of a new cinematic language, with himself as its perhaps reluctant figurehead. The film's stylish murder sequences, paranoid atmosphere and obsessive attention to visual detail certainly laid the blueprint for the rest of his career. He followed this film with The Cat o' Nine Tails and then Four Flies on Grey Velvet, completing what's often referred to as his Animal Trilogy, a very loose grouping really, as the films aren't connected by plot or character, just by zoological titling and a shared fascination with murder, mystery and mayhem. At the time of recording, Argento has directed over 20 films, and his influence stretches far beyond Italy. He produced George A. Romero's Dawn of the Dead, and his distinctive approach to cinematography, editing, music and stylized violence has left an indelible mark on horror cinema worldwide. Despite a less consistent critical reception in later years, Argento's influence has only grown. Directors such as John Carpenter, Guillermo del Toro, Gaspar Noé, and even Darren Aronofsky have cited him as a key inspiration, and you can certainly see his fingerprints on many films, from Black Swan to Mandy, and to the more stylized corners of contemporary horror and thriller cinema. He has received multiple Lifetime Achievement Awards, and retrospectives of his work have been hosted by the BFI, the Museum of Modern Art, and Cinémathèque Française. In 2022, Turin hosted a major retrospective of his work entitled Dario Argento, The Exhibit, which also featured costumes, props, scripts, videos, storyboards, and in fact anything that an Argento fan could possibly want to examine. Four Flies on Grey Velvet, then, is the third and final installment in the Animal Trilogy, and it contains a direct homage to the Leopard Man and its source material Black Alibi. Also, much like Lewton's RKO films, the title in this case actually came long before the story. This film also marks a clear transition in Argento's work, moving away from his first two films, which were highly stylized but still relatively conventional, and heading towards something more dreamlike and surreal. Argento's frustration with the wave of imitators that followed The Bird with the Crystal Plumage is most likely what pushed him to experiment even further with this film. He's openly stated that while writing Four Flies on Grey Velvet, he wasn't interested in making another traditional giallo. Instead, he wanted to push the boundaries of the genre and also of his own personal style. To quote from his autobiography, Fear, quote, "I wanted to try everything, to leave no stone unturned, but still be myself. Little by little, I was outlining a very coherent kind of personal mythology, one film entwined with another. I was quoting myself, but at the same time, I had made a blank slate of my past." End quote. And this idea of pushing his own boundaries is certainly reflected in the film's visual style. Compared to his first two films, Four Flies on Grey Velvet is a massive leap forward in terms of stylization, editing, and also camera movement. One standout sequence shows a blackmailer contacting the killer by telephone. But instead of simply cutting between the two, the camera follows the wires running from the telephone box, down into the earth, into the telephone exchange, and finally to the receiver on the other end. It's a beautifully fluid piece of filmmaking, and this kind of kinetic camera work would become a signature of Argento's later work. This film also contains the seeds of many of Argento's later movies. The puppet-like mask worn by the killer foreshadows something that we will see in a pivotal scene in his later film Deep Red. The eerie lighting in the subway is just a few light bulbs away from the garish technicolor of Inferno and Suspiria. The aggressive flinging open of red curtains in the theatre in the film's opening moments is something we will see again in both Deep Red and Opera, and the use of wind-blown trees to create tension is something we will see again in his film Phenomena. So in many ways, Four Flies on Grey Velvet is a transitional film where he experiments with new techniques that will become hallmarks of his later career. Before I get into the spoilers, I want to take a moment to talk about the casting process because, frankly, it is fascinating. The process of finding the right lead for Four Flies on Grey Velvet was anything but straightforward and contains a fair amount of behind-the-scenes drama. Michael Brandon plays the lead role, Roberto Tobias, but his casting in Four Flies was far from straightforward. In fact, according to Luigi Cozzi, the casting process was a nightmare. Argento initially planned to cast Tony Musante, who had played the lead in The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, but Musante demanded an extortionate fee, and on top of that, Argento and Musante's relationship first time round had been less than smooth. Terence Stamp showed interest, but he wanted changes to the character, which Argento refused. Then British actor Tom Courtenay was considered, but since Paramount was backing the film, they had their own ideas. And naturally, those ideas included casting either John Lennon or Ringo Starr. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Argento wasn't too keen. Paramount then suggested the musician James Taylor, which Argento briefly entertained before the film Two Lane Blacktop completely flopped at the box office. Michael York was up next, and he was actually signed, but at the last minute he was stuck finishing the movie Zeppelin and couldn't make it. Argento didn't want to delay, so he started looking for a replacement. And that's when he remembered the actor Michael Brandon, an American he had seen in the film Lovers and Other Strangers. People had even commented that Brandon and Argento looked a bit alike. And more on that later. For the role of the icy cold Nina, Argento cast the actress Mimsy Farmer, who was born Merle Farmer in 1945 in Chicago. She got her rather unusual nickname from the Lewis Carroll poem Jabberwocky, the direct line being, quote, "All Mimsy were the Borogroves," end quote. Raised in Los Angeles, her early jobs included handling rabbits for a magician and working as a cinema usherette before she broke into acting. She started on TV in the early 1960s with guest spots on programs like The Donna Reed Show, Perry Mason, My Three Sons, and sci-fi classic The Outer Limits. But Hollywood mostly cast her as party girls in B-movies, like the fantastically titled Hot Rods to Hell in 1967 and the equally fantastic Riot on Sunset Strip, again in 1967. But in the late 60s, she had had enough, and she packed her bags to move to Italy. Europe was where her career really took off. Her breakthrough role came with the film More in 1969, a drug addiction drama that caught Dario Argento's eye, leading to her role in Four Flies. But according to Luigi Cozzi, Argento and Farmer never really got along that much. Their relationship on set was extremely professional, but it was also distant, which, given that Nina is cold and detached, may well have helped with the characterization. Farmer later admitted to Cozzi that she, in fact, only took the role to break into the Italian film scene. She figured that working with Argento would boost her profile, but she didn't really like the character, she didn't really like the genre, and while she respected him, she didn't particularly like Argento as a director either. That being said, she was incredibly professional, she put in the work and delivers a very strong performance, even if she would much rather have been doing something else. Ironically enough, her plan worked. Despite not being a fan of horror, she became a staple of Italian genre cinema, starring in the films The Perfume of the Lady in Black in 1974, Autopsy in 1975, and The Black Cat in 1981. For the role of Dahlia, Nina's cousin, though in the original treatment Dahlia was actually Nina's sister, Argento cast French-Canadian model and actress Francine Rosset. Born in Quebec in 1947, Rosset trained at the National Theatre School of Canada, graduating in 1966. She went on to have a very impressive career and is perhaps best known for the film Au revoir les enfants in 1987. But she also starred in the films Lumiere in 1976, for which she was nominated for a César Award for Best Supporting Actress, and also the film The Disappearance in 1977. Beyond her own career, she's perhaps most widely known as the third wife of Donald Sutherland. They were married for 52 years, until his tragic death in 2024, and she is the mother of 3 of his sons. She wasn't exactly a staple of Italian horror, but Argento clearly saw something in her that fit the bill. And while her role as Dahlia isn't the film's most prominent, she adds an intriguing presence, one that possibly would have played differently, and dare I say it more interestingly, had the character remained Nina's sister rather than her cousin. And now that we've talked about the cast, we're about to get into some of the key plot elements, so it's spoiler time. If you're in the UK, For Flies on Grey Velvet is available to rent from Amazon. It's streaming for free with an Amazon Prime membership, and it's also available on the Arrow Video app and website. Argento has been very open in interviews and his autobiography about the fact that his marriage to his then-wife Marissa Casal was going through serious difficulties when he was making this film. He says that even before deciding on the identity of the killer, he was actually far more interested in writing a story about a couple that refuses to admit that they're in crisis. We've already discussed the casting of Brandon and the fact that, if you look at photos taken at the time, he actually bore a striking resemblance to Argento himself. Then, for the role of Nina, Argento cast Mimsy Farmer, who at the time bore a very strong resemblance to his then-wife Marissa. Now, Argento insists that the casting of 2 actors who physically resembled both he and his then-partner was not deliberate, or at least not consciously. But when For Flies on Grey Velvet premiered, Marissa almost broke down in tears, saying that she felt that everyone in the audience was staring at her. It was only then that Argento says he realised that people might see Roberto as a stand-in for him and Nina as a stand-in for Marissa. All of which gets a little bit difficult when we find out that Nina is in fact the mad killer, and she's not just responsible for the murders, she's actually been tormenting Roberto from the very start of their marriage. First of all, she stages a fake murder, though crucially, Roberto never finds out he didn't actually kill anyone. Then she blackmails him, stalks him, threatens him, and finally escalates to multiple murders. And here's where it gets even more strange. Her motivation has nothing to do with Roberto himself. She isn't out for revenge against him personally. What she's doing is enacting revenge on her father, whom Roberto just happens to be unfortunate enough to resemble. We learn that her father, or possibly it isn't her father, was an abusive, controlling man who raised her as a boy because he wanted a son instead of a daughter. His abuse ultimately drove her to a psychological break and led to her being committed to a sanatorium. And so, when Nina met Roberto, it wasn't love at first sight. It was more like hatred at first sight, and an opportunity for revenge. She sought him out, married him purely in order to destroy him, and then spends the entire film meticulously carrying out that plan. Not surprisingly, this film didn't really help Argento's marriage, and he and Marissa split up, although amicably, shortly afterwards. Now, whilst Roberto is clearly not deserving of the quite bizarre revenge drama created by his wife, he is actually far from being your typical sympathetic lead. He's selfish, he's unfaithful, and he doesn't really seem particularly fazed by his own actions. The entire plot is driven by a witness blackmailing Roberto for a murder he believes himself to have committed in the beginning of the film. But instead of grappling with his own conscience, Roberto is actually far more concerned with saving his own skin. When he does eventually confide in others, their reactions are just as questionable. Nobody really cares about what he's done, only what it might mean for them. Even his friend Godfrey, or God for short, who seems to represent some form of divine protection, barely bats an eyelid. This lack of a clear-cut hero can be jarring, especially if you're used to films where we're meant to root for a likeable protagonist. And it's not just Roberto. To be honest, very few people in this film are easy to root for. Nina is a psychotic killer and swings between cold, hysterical and distant. Dahlia is duplicitous and having an affair with her cousin's husband. Amelia the maid is self-serving and a blackmailer, and Roberto's friends are pretentious and tedious, sitting around at parties telling problematic jokes in a way that Argento has said was a parody of the intellectual upper class of the time. There are some lighter characters, such as the aforementioned God and his sidekick the Professor, though the latter falls more into comedic territory, which I will get to a little bit later. For me, the only real standout in terms of likability would be Orosio, the private detective. This character is interesting for a couple of reasons. Firstly, he is, by his own admission, absolutely terrible at his job. He's never solved a case before, but reasons that this time he's due for a lucky break. He's actually the only character in the film who feels remotely warm or sympathetic. And what makes him truly groundbreaking is that this character is openly gay, a very rare thing to see in a mainstream thriller, especially one produced by Paramount in the early 1970s. Now, to a modern audience, the depiction might feel a little bit clunky, even stereotypical, but we need to remember that at the time this was incredibly progressive. Argento has spoken about how he wanted the character to be a rebel, but it was actor Jean-Pierre Mariel who suggested making the character explicitly gay. Argento embraced the idea and has since gone on to say that he was incredibly proud of including a gay character in the film. He actually wanted to follow it up with a Giallo featuring a gay hero, but he was advised against it, as everyone told him that it would be box office poison. Even so, having a supporting character as a gay man was a very bold move, especially for a Catholic country like Italy, where LGBTQ+ rights were still very much in flux. Same-sex activity had been legal since 1890, but there had been multiple attempts to recriminalise it. Meanwhile, in the UK, sex between two consenting gay male adults had only been decriminalised 5 years earlier. In the US, meanwhile, the Stonewall riots had taken place just 3 years before this film was released. So, while a modern audience might cringe at some of the character's stereotypical mannerisms, it's really important to recognise how truly groundbreaking this was at the time. Argento himself has continued to include LGBTQ+ characters in many of his films throughout his career. While we're on the subject, it is worth mentioning that despite her backstory, there is no suggestion at all that Nina is trans, nor is the film making any outdated queer killer statements. Argento doesn't fall into the trap of linking gender identity or queerness to villainy. Instead, the film is about the consequences of misogyny and abuse. Nina is the victim of an abusive adult, whose treatment of her shattered her psyche. Her madness is rooted in trauma and revenge, and not gender identity. So if you've seen both of this week's films by now, the connection between them should be crystal clear. The murder of Consuelo in The Leopard Man is directly echoed, one might even say lovingly borrowed, by Argento in the death of Amelia, Nina's would-be blackmailer, and Roberto's maid. In The Leopard Man, Consuelo is late for an assignation in the cemetery with her secret and impoverished lover. Dejected that she has missed him, she sits down and loses track of time. The caretaker rings a bell, warning that he is locking the gates for the evening. But lost in thought, Consuelo doesn't hear him and is accidentally locked in for the night. Trapped inside, she looks for an exit and calls out over the wall for help. A passerby responds, promising to find someone, but it's too late. Alone in a cemetery with the killer, Consuelo is murdered. Argento, it must be said, is not the only director to pay homage to this scene. In 1971, Sergio Martino references it in the film The Strange Vice of Mrs. Ward, complete with a park keeper ringing a warning bell just as a soon-to-be victim encounters her killer. But Argento's version is far more direct. It's more of a recreation than a nod, at least up to a point. In Four Flies, Amelia, the maid, sits on a park bench. She watches children playing, movements synchronized to the beat of music blaring from nearby loudspeakers. A couple kisses, half hidden from view. The sun begins to dip, and the shadows lengthen. Amelia lights a cigarette and drifts into her thoughts, unaware that the park is closing. Suddenly the loudspeakers go silent, and just like that, she's trapped. As darkness falls, panic sets in. She scrambles for a way out. Someone whispers her name from the shadows, mocking her. She pushes through dense foliage, branches clawing at her skin. She stumbles into an incredibly narrow passageway and nearly becomes stuck, with the killer closing in behind her. And then, eventually, after much struggling, she makes it to the wall that encircles the park. She screams for help, and just like Consuelo before her, somebody answers from beyond the wall. Help is agonizingly close, but completely out of reach. And finally, the killer strikes. With this scene and the other set pieces in the film, Argento aestheticizes violence, turning murder into a kind of perverse art form, pulling out the stops both visually and technically. Nor would this be the only time he would homage a Hollywood noir murder thriller. He references the 1946 movie The Spiral Staircase in a few of his films, notably The Eye Watching from the Wardrobe in Deep Red and The Murder of Tilda in Tenebrae. One of the most impressive aspects of Four Flies on Grey Velvet is just how technically ambitious it is, especially for 1971. This was a time before the Steadicam as we know it today, which meant that every single fluid tracking shot or POV sequence or impossible perspective had to be achieved using fairly bulky, fairly primitive equipment. But Argento, never one to let technical limitations get in his way, pushed the boundaries of what was possible at the time. His creativity is particularly evident in the film's climax, which features an incredibly detailed slow-motion bullet sequence, something that we would see again, but perfected, over a decade later in his film opera. There's also a car crash sequence which is unlike anything that anyone had really seen before. For both of these scenes, he used a German Peterzett camera, which is the same one that Michelangelo Antonioni had used in the movie Zabriskie Point for its famous explosion scene. And this isn't just any camera, it shoots at a staggering 36,000 frames per second, meaning it can capture an incredible level of detail. But there was a catch. Due to the fast speed at which it moves through the camera, there is a significant risk that the film reel itself can catch fire, and in order to prevent against this, it actually has to be submerged in oil. So that's right. Argento literally risks setting his film reels on fire just to get the perfect shot. And if that doesn't sum up his commitment to pushing visual boundaries, then I don't really know what does. Now, much as I love this film, I'm going to admit that, for me, not everything works perfectly. The film contains some so-called comedic sequences, and for me, quite frankly, they just don't land. Whether these were just culturally specific, or perhaps too much of their time, for me they just don't translate well today and can feel a bit jarring, almost taking you out of the experience altogether. And then there's the soundtrack, or specifically the song that plays over the opening credits. Now, I love Ennio Morricone, but his interpretation of progressive rock is really not my cup of tea, and Argento didn't originally choose it either. The original plan for the soundtrack was something very different, as it was going to be scored by the British rock band Deep Purple. Sadly, bureaucracy got in the way. At the time, for a film to be considered Italian and receive government funding, a certain percentage of the crew and cast had to be, well, actually Italian. Now, that seems reasonable enough, but Argento found himself at odds with the system while making the film. The trouble really began when Argento had a falling out with his original Italian editor, Franco Fraticelli, who had edited both Bird with the Crystal Plumage and Cat of Nine Tails. This issue was because he was editing 3 films at once, and Argento wanted complete dedication. So he replaced him with a French editor, Françoise Bonneau. That alone was enough to raise bureaucratic eyebrows. But a film with an American leading man, a British rock band, and a French editor, that was starting to look suspiciously un-Italian. Thankfully, Mimsy Farmer, although American, was married to an Italian, so she managed to slip in just under the wire. The ministry threatened to withdraw funding, and if Argento wanted their precious lira, he had a decision to make. He could keep the editor, or he could keep the band, but he couldn't keep both. In the end, Argento made a pragmatic choice. He needed the editor. There was no easy replacement. Deep Purple, on the other hand, were not exactly indispensable. And he turned to Ennio Morricone, the maestro that he'd worked with on his first 2 films. And as it turns out, Argento wasn't entirely thrilled with Morricone's score. Tensions flared between the two, and although Morricone's score remains in the film, they wouldn't work together again for another 25 years. So, in another timeline, Four Flies on Grey Velvet might have had a blistering Deep Purple soundtrack, and one can't help but wonder what might have been. As I mentioned earlier, the opening music for me is the biggest misstep, mainly due to the so-called vocals. But once the murders start, Morricone's discordant and chaotic approach actually does fit the increasing madness of the plot. It's just a pity that Nina couldn't have slaughtered Roberto's lead singer while she was at it. Upon its release in Italy in 1971, the film did respectable business at the box office, but it failed to reach the same commercial heights as Bird with the Crystal Plumage. Internationally, its fate was even stranger. Distribution was a mess, and for years the film was difficult to see outside of Italy, which only added to its cult status. These days it is of course more widely available, and it's recognised as a crucial bridge between Argento's early Hitchcockian thrillers and the full-blooded hallucinatory horror of Deep Red and Suspiria. And for all of its flaws, I absolutely love it. On a surface level, the connection between this week's 2 films is fairly obvious. Argento openly acknowledges his debt to the Leopard Man, with the murder of Emilia echoing the death of Consuela in the cemetery almost beat for beat. But I think the influence runs deeper than that. Firstly, there's the idea of guilt. Both films centre around protagonists who are, to varying degrees, complicit. In The Leopard Man, Kiki and Manning set the entire chain of events in motion with their ill-advised publicity stunt. In Four Flies, Roberto believes himself to have killed a man and is haunted by the sense that he somehow invited this nightmare in. In both cases, guilt festers and distorts reality, dragging our leads deeper into fear and paranoia. Then there's also the question of fate. In The Leopard Man, characters are warned of their destinies, only to find every attempt to change them futile. Meanwhile, in Four Flies, Roberto is plagued by recurring dreams of an execution, a haunting premonition that finally comes true in the climax. Finally, there's the idea of the Giallo itself. The Leopard Man, along with Robert Siodmak's 1946 movie The Spiral Staircase, can be seen as a clear influence on the Giallo genre. Sequences in The Spiral Staircase have also been emulated across several key Giallo. Even its raincoat and hat-wearing killer hiding in the garden foreshadows the trenchcoat and trilby-wearing murderers that would menace Italy 20 years later. And The Leopard Man itself features protagonists in a strange location away from home who are accidentally caught up in a series of murder set pieces, each one meticulously designed to maximise suspense and deliver a calculated shock. As I mentioned, Argento states in his autobiography that with The Leopard Man, Lewton and Tourneur invented the modern cinematic serial killer. The 1943 movie, of course, is not a giallo. It predates the genre by nearly 30 years and was shot on a Hollywood soundstage and not in Rome. But structurally, stylistically, and thematically, it deserves a space at the head of the table. That's it for this week's Horror Double Bill. Thanks again for listening. If you're enjoying the show, please remember to rate, review and subscribe. It really helps with the algorithm much more than you think. And if you've got horror-loving friends, please spread the word. I'd also love to hear from you. Perhaps you've got memories of seeing Four Flies on Grey Velvet for the first time, or perhaps the Leopard Man gave you nightmares as a kid. Either way, drop me a line at thehorrordouble@gmail.com. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram at thehorrordouble for all the extras, oddities and updates. Next Sunday, I will be back with another pairing, and this time I'm staying closer to home. I'll be digging into British suburban horror with Frightmare from 1974. That's from director Pete Walker. And following that up with Possum from 2018, the haunting feature debut from Matthew Holness. So next week it's tea, biscuits, and absolute psychological collapse. If you want to watch ahead of time, Frightmare is currently available on YouTube, and also, I believe, on Shudder, while Possum is available for rent from Amazon Prime. And again, I'm not sponsored. So watch them if you can, and I'll see you next week. Have a very good week. Goodbye.